The International Court of Justice in The Hague has ordered Israel to stop its military offensive in the city of Rafah in southern Gaza. The United Nations top court described the humanitarian situation there as disastrous and ordered Israel to allow unhindered access of aid. Israel has repeatedly said it has the right to defend itself from Hamas militants and is unlikely to comply with the ruling. The court also ordered Israel to report its progress in applying the measures within a month. The ruling was in response to a request from South Africa. Though the court has no way to enforce its decision, the ruling does add further international pressure on the Israeli government. Here is the president of the court, Nawaf Salam.
The court considers that, in conformity with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah Governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
Well, let's look at what this might mean with Marc Weller. He's Professor of International Law and International Constitutional Studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Welcome to DW. Israeli citizens suffered terrible atrocities on October the 7th last year. Is the government of Israel argued in court that it's taking exceptional measures to minimise harm to the civilian population in Gaza. Today's ruling does seem to indicate that the court sees things rather differently.
Well, Israel is, of course, entitled to the right to self-defense in response to the horrible, atrocious events of the 7th of October. But the right to self-defense is not unlimited, and it can never transgress humanitarian law, the law that supports the dignity of human persons, human beings, in any circumstance, even in war. And the court has now spoken for the third time in just a few months, which is unprecedented, ordering Israel the first time not to do anything which could constitute acts of genocide against the people of Gaza, the Palestinians. The second time, it has ordered Israel to ensure that there is full humanitarian access. And now, almost unprecedentedly, it has ordered a state claiming to be in the middle of a self-defense operation to halt a major element of that campaign, its Rafah offensive.
OK. So let's pick up the two. You mentioned there two previous rulings there, nothing that constitutes genocide and full humanitarian access. Today's ruling required Israel to provide verification or to allow verification of humanitarian access, which seems to indicate that the court does not believe that Israel has complied with its earlier ruling.
Well, it certainly hasn't complied in the sense that the court has found that the situation has gotten much worse. And therefore, very unusually, it has made yet a further ruling in this case. And the court is very, very concerned about the future of those individuals who were sent to Rafah as a safe place by Israel to escape the consequences of the fighting, and who are now being displaced from there without adequate measures have been taken to ensure their survival in other places. And the court has noticed that no such adequate steps have been taken.
OK, so there we have a problem, don't we? Because the court rules do something about humanitarian access. The court rules today against Israel and says, stop what's going on in Rafah and let us check that you've complied with our earlier ruling. We heard yesterday from an Israeli government spokesman who was quoted as saying, no power on earth will stop Israel from protecting its citizens and going after Hamas in Gaza. The court can rule until it's blue in the face. Where's its or else?
Well, how many legions does the Pope have, as was famously asked? The court doesn't have an army to enforce its wishes. It could have an army if the UN Security Council were able to exercise its role, because the UN Security Council has, in principle, the power to enforce judgments of the court. But, of course, with the US veto, that is not possible. And therefore, it is the very, very significant diplomatic pressure. You saw the indictments by the International Criminal Court in relation to Mr. Netanyahu.
A completely separate court, we should say.
And those have been backed up now yet again, in addition to their individual responsibility, by these actions directed towards the state of Israel. And it really makes the diplomatic space for Israel much, much more difficult to maneuver in. Israel has been arguing we have been a model of humanitarian law compliance. But with all of this evidence, those arguments ring increasingly hollow, as most people who watch television, of course, already know.
Okay.
But once you have these authoritative findings from the highest judicial bodies in the world, it is much more difficult for Israel to maintain its position that it is, in a modest way, defending itself.
Does this ruling impose any duties or obligations on any other signatories to the court to do or not do anything? I'm thinking of the United States, amongst others, who it could be argued are supplying Israel with the wherewithal to carry out the activities that the court has now prohibited.
Funny you should say that, as, of course, you are hinting at. Germany is at present subject to a case in the International Court of Justice where Nicaragua has argued that the continued provision of arms by Germany to Israel violates the Genocide Convention. And for a state like Germany, which prides itself as a model of compliance with international law, on the one hand, but which also wants to remain a very strong friend of Israel, that is a real huge dilemma coming up for it. The United States will not likely consider the court in relation to its arms exports, which are, of course, quite massive. The United Kingdom may be in a different position because under its ministerial code, it cannot license the export of weapons if these weapons are likely to be used against international law or certainly in favor of a campaign of genocide. These various pronouncements, again, make the space to maneuver for Israel and for its allies significantly smaller. Doesn't end the conflict, but it is another piece in the mosaic which will help, I think, persuade Israel ultimately to try not to isolate itself entirely from the international community.
And just a final word on genocide, because today's ruling is a part of a broader lawsuit brought by South Africa last year accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. Just explain to us briefly what impact today's decision has on that.
Well, this is part of that case. It is the third interim action by the court to protect the people of Palestine during the many years it will take the court to give the actual ruling as to whether or not genocide has taken place. So this action does not actually prejudice the finding of the court at the end of that lengthy period of legal argument as to whether or not genocide occurred. Remember the Bosnian case, where most thought we were faced with a significant campaign of genocide. And after many years of deliberation, the court found that Srebrenica was genocide, but the rest of this dreadful campaign of crimes against humanity didn't quite measure up to that high legal standard.
That's very clear, Professor. Thank you so much for walking us through that. Professor Marc Weller from the University of Cambridge.
We have team coverage of today's ruling from Israel and South Africa. I'm joined by our correspondent, Ibrahim. She's in Jerusalem, and Dianne Hawker, who's in Johannesburg. To both of you, welcome. Aya, let me start with you. Have we seen or heard any reaction from the Israeli government?
We've heard sort of individual reactions from members of government and the opposition. So let me just walk you through what we've heard so far. We've heard from Benny Gantz. He's a minister in the war cabinet. And after the ruling was issued, he said that Israel would continue its, quote, just and necessary war against Hamas to return its hostages. And he said that his country is committed to fighting for the hostages, for their return, and the security of its citizens anywhere. And that includes Rafah. So that gives you a hint into the kind of discussions that may be happening in the war cabinet right now. There's still that commitment and focus on Rafah. We've also heard from Bezalel Smotrich, that's the far-right finance minister in Israel, who said that Israel, I'm paraphrasing now, Israel stopping the fight in Rafah or the fight for Rafah is the equivalent of Israel sort of forfeiting its right to exist. and so there's a definite sign from the far right that they, would reject this ruling, but that's unsurprising. We've also heard from Yair Lapid that he's the leader of the opposition and normally a fierce critic of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He also rejected the ruling and said that the ICJ did not make a connection, or perhaps strong enough of a connection, between the release of the hostages and the stopping of the fighting. That is not wholly accurate, because Judge Salam today, as he announced that ruling, did of course talk about how disturbing it is that Hamas still holds hostages and called for their release. We haven't heard from senior members like the Prime Minister or the President yet, but we can expect to hear from them soon. And it will be something along these lines that we've just heard. And you can also expect even harsher criticism as the Prime Minister. It's sort of become a habit whenever Israel faces this challenge from international institution, accusations of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel propaganda sort of are the first thing that the Prime Minister comes back with. We haven't heard that yet, but that's very, very probable.
All right, Dianne, let me take this to you. We spoke with a legal scholar earlier today who said that this ruling was definitely a clear-cut win for South Africa. What have the reactions been there?
Well, the South African government is definitely taking it as a win. We heard from the Department of International Relations earlier on. They put out a video statement from the Director General there saying that this was a groundbreaking ruling. And he's essentially saying that South Africa intends to continue with this process that they've currently started. They will also go to the United Nations Security Council now that this ruling has been made, and look to the Security Council to take some steps that in a way bolster that ruling. Zain Dango also, saying that although the ICJ didn't use the word ceasefire, that the effect of what they have called for is a de facto ceasefire, which is something that South Africa has been calling for several months now. So definitely seen from the South African government perspective as a win for their cause, and also an opportunity to continue to collect additional information for their case going forward.
DW's Dianne Hawker in Johannesburg and DW's Ibrahim in Jerusalem. To both of you, thank you. I'm joined now by Michael Becker. He's Assistant Professor of International Human Rights Law at Trinity College in Dublin. He is also a former legal advisor at the International Court of Justice. It's good to have you with us, Mr. Becker. Let me just ask you, is this an outright victory for South Africa that brought this case to the court?
Well, it's certainly the case that South Africa received just about everything that it requested from the court this time around. We know that South Africa has gone to the ICJ multiple times seeking provisional measures, this kind of urgent interim relief, and has asked each time for the court to order Israel to suspend the military operations. Up until this point, the court declined to take that step, to go that far. And so the fact that the court has now intervened in this way, ordering Israel to suspend military operations at least in the Rafah part of Gaza, is a pretty extraordinary development for South Africa. And it's also pretty extraordinary, I would add, that the court has ordered Israel to allow unimpeded access to UN fact-finding bodies or commissions of inquiry. This is also something that parties in multiple cases have requested before, and the court has always been very reluctant to order. So that also suggests an extremely high degree of concern on the part of the court.
How much, then, of a defeat is this for Israel?
Well, it certainly adds to the list of defeats that I think Israel has experienced in this case along the way. Israel all along has urged the court not to take this step, making the argument that this would leave Israel unable to defend itself when it's involved in an ongoing conflict. But this really means that the court has found that there is simply no other way at this point to preserve the rights at issue in this case, the rights of the Palestinian population in Gaza, not to be subject to acts that might meet the legal definition of genocide. I do think that the order just came out. I haven't had a chance to completely comb through it in detail. But as far as I can tell, the court didn't say anything about what this leaves Israel with the ability to do. But I think it can't really be construed to mean that Israel is no longer allowed to defend itself if Israel suffers future attacks. So if Hamas, for example, were to abuse what the court has ordered here by using Rafah as a staging area to launch rocket attacks at Israel, the court's order isn't going to stop Israel, and I don't think it's intended to stop Israel in that particular circumstance. So really, one would hope that this also incentivizes Hamas to enter into what is really a de facto ceasefire.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. You know as well as I do that Israel has already declared that it will not comply with any orders to stop its military operation. So at the end of the day, what difference will this judgment make?
Well, that's true. And I haven't seen the immediate Israeli response yet to this decision, but we can probably expect a message of defiance in terms of what the court has said today. And you're right. I don't know that this is going to have any kind of immediate impact on how Israel is carrying out the offensive in Rafah. It might be wishful thinking, but perhaps behind the scenes, this does create a kind of off-ramp for elements or constituencies within the Israeli government who are urging for a change of course. But I don't think we'll see anything along those lines in terms of the public narrative coming from Israel.
Yeah, we're still waiting for official reactions from Israel. Let's talk about South Africa for a moment. South Africa's request for a ceasefire. It was just one part of a broader lawsuit filed late last year accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. What does today's ruling, what does it mean for this overarching case?
Right. So this kind of set of provisional measures requests, and this is the fourth time that South Africa has returned to the court since filing that case at the end of December last year. All of the decisions and determinations that the court makes along the way in responding to these requests for interim relief, these are without prejudice to the case on the merits. And so it will still, it's going to be years away after the case has been fully briefed and fully argued, that the court will have to decide that underlying question. Has Israel violated the Genocide Convention? Has it breached its obligations under that treaty? Those questions remain unresolved, and it wasn't for the court today to make any kind of determinations about whether what has happened in the past constitutes genocide, or necessarily even what's happening right now, whether that constitutes genocide. This is all about a risk. This is about a forward-looking risk. And so South Africa has been able to persuade the court that there is a serious, urgent risk that unless the court intervenes, something that might constitute genocide could actually take place. And that's what the court has relied upon in seeing that it's legally justified to issue these measures.
Mr. Becker, what does this ruling mean for countries that support Israel? And of course, I'm thinking of the United States here, for example, with weapons and other military aid. Are they on a slippery slope right now?
I think that was already the case since the court's order in March. And this really does put the Biden administration in a difficult position. The Biden administration had already suggested that if Israel were to proceed with the military offensive in Rafah, that this would be kind of a red line for the U.S. And we did see that at least some limited shipments of weapons were withheld. But the U.S. seems to be taking kind of a very equivocal position on whether what's happening in Rafah constitutes that major military operation that they objected to. I think the court's order today then puts further pressure on the Biden administration to say enough is enough. Now is the time for Israel to step back and find a different way to manage this conflict.
Michael Becker, Assistant Professor of International Human Rights Law. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and helping us analyze this story, this breaking story here, the court ordering Israel to stop its military campaign in Rafah. Thank you.
Thank you.